Hello, and welcome to Stumbling Forward, a podcast about real people and the failures, spiritual awakenings, life changes, and lessons learned that shape them into who they are today. Hello, and welcome to Stumbling Forward. I am your host, Erika, and today I have the opportunity of interviewing Rachel Dungan. Rachel, hello, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Would you like to tell us a little bit about you, what you're doing, and who you are?
Sure. So again, my name is Rachel. I'm currently in a director role with an organization that's largely focused on helping to support researchers and those in the broader sort of health systems field. Not necessarily doing clinical research or biomedical research, but more systems level research on how we can improve health policy, healthcare provision, and other health research systems to increase impact, improve outcomes. And in my role, I effectively lead what feels like a consulting team. Our model works a bit like what you would expect out of a think tank, where I'll lead a series of special topic projects, research projects, or development of new programs, and I'll lead a team in helping to coordinate and complete that work for a particular partner or client. A lot of the work is very collaborative, parts of it feel very creative, and that's the nature of the work. And then outside of my work, I do some strategy consulting and advising with nonprofits and community-based organizations.
Wow, that's really impressive.
Thanks.
I had looked at your profile on LinkedIn, and your overall education background and what you do is very, very impressive and a little intimidating. If I'm being honest, I was like, wow, she is really, really smart. But that's really, it's interesting stuff that what you're doing. And so when you're working on these kind of mini projects, are these a week or two at a time? Are these really long-term projects? What does that look like typically?
Good question. It depends on the project. So some of them will actually be multi-year projects where we maybe have a standing relationship with a partner, a client, or a funder, and we'll build out a timeline with proposed milestones and set deliverables, and there's a whole kind of contract involved in tracking metrics of success, for example. Some of them are shorter turnaround projects. I really enjoy doing is using things like human-centered design sprints or collaborative strategic planning retreats to work with partners and clients, hear what their priorities and objectives are, and then use some creative problem-solving strategies to help them pretty quickly arrive at a solution that they might be able to test in their work. And some of those shorter projects can be a couple weeks to a month. For example, led an effort not too long ago to use one of these human-centered design exercises to help my organization arrive at a candidate pool for its board of directors that was more diverse. And through the human-centered design process, we're able to identify a number of places along the candidate recruitment and vetting process where it was very likely that bias was impacting people's decisions. So we pinpointed those spots, came up with quick solutions, tried and tested them, and by the end we were able to run a recruitment process that resulted in a significantly more diverse candidate pool than for us to choose from for our final board of directors, so it would be more representative and inclusive.
That's fantastic. That is needed, especially nowadays with the kind of death of DEI in a sense. I think it's really important to get those diverse perspectives and diverse experiences to really have a bigger picture of what you're doing and what you're trying to fix.
Right.
No, I think that's amazing. So when you're working with these groups, these are not necessarily people that you are directly managing every day. Some of these people might be folks that you're overseeing for a project, but in the hierarchy sense of things, you don't necessarily have a leadership position over them.
Yeah, I work in a matrix organization. There are technically verticals. There are several people who report directly to me as their supervisor. I help them with their professional development, their performance reviews, for example. But there are plenty of people who report to me on projects for which I am their project lead, and I have authority and responsibility for the project itself, the quality of the work, the final product. But some of the people who partner with me or report to me on the project are not people who report to me in a supervisory capacity. I'll give a good example. I help to lead some AI-focused projects at my organization, and we did a training yesterday, and one of the staff members on the IT team came and gave a presentation on some of the technical aspects of an AI tool or system that we're trying to roll out. I'm not his direct supervisor, but because I was running the training in that aspect of the AI portfolio, I was responsible for making sure that his work and his presentation was well integrated so that staff would get out of the training what they needed.
Awesome. And Do you find that
Yeah.
since you're not directly responsible for them in a developmental perspective, but you are responsible for their performance on this particular project, do you feel like that's easier or is it harder for you than someone that you directly manage?
That's a great question. My answer has a couple of components to it. It can be interesting and beneficial to have people collaborating with you on a project or reporting to you on a project that you don't have supervisory responsibility over, because it almost absolves you of the responsibility for fully doing coaching that they might need in terms of a performance need or improvement. And then you can instead connect with them in a coaching capacity as it relates specifically to your project work. Sometimes people that you don't work with in a supervisory relationship will bring new ideas, or they'll approach collaboration with you differently. Maybe they'll be more open-minded or more forthcoming because you're not their boss, and so they may be more vulnerable sharing ideas as a collaborator if perhaps they might otherwise be intimidated by their supervisor. I think where it becomes challenging is that in a case where there isn't a vertical reporting relationship, sometimes it can feel like you don't have authority to hold people accountable. And I'm very empathic, I'm very relational, I'm very collaborative. I like to meet people where they are. I'm a kind of reformed people pleaser. So I think it took me a while to figure out how to create enough structure that people who didn't report to me still felt like they had the scaffolding to be able to keep the work moving. One way I've found to do that often involves organizing people around the mission and the potential impact and the objectives for the work. So instead of having the motivating factor be, I'm your boss, you need to do a good job, which feels controlling and authoritative, instead it's a true leadership role where you say, this is the mission, this is what we're trying to achieve, let's get everyone excited about that. And then people of their own accord feel a sense of ownership in the work, and that motivates or mobilizes them to really lean in a way that can keep the project intact even if someone isn't reporting to me as their supervisor. Does
I
that make
like that.
sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. As you were saying that, I recognize the pros and the cons, so to speak, of you don't have necessarily the authority in a sense to hold them accountable for certain things, but you are still responsible for them. That part can sometimes be a little challenging, and you do have to be creative in how you get them to buy in. The other side is that they might be a little bit more open because there's not that fear of wanting to impress you because you're my manager, and if I screw up, does that impact how you view me or my performance? There are
Right.
some positives and challenges that come with that. And so that's it's definitely an interesting position that you're in where you're trying to balance both all the time, trying to keep that up because you do have to come up with different tactics to motivate people, especially when they don't actually report to you. So how do I get them bought in? How do I get them to collaborate and to participate in a way that is meaningful?
Yeah, I actually had the benefit of some coaching. I had approached someone in the organization who's in a more senior role who I really respect. I really enjoy and appreciate her leadership style. And I felt like I was hitting a bit of a wall on some of my projects. And one of her notes, which was very helpful and very accurate, and I think as maybe an emerging leader, or at least one of the younger members of the leadership team at my organization, I felt like I needed to prove my leadership. And she said, I actually don't think people fail to see you as an authority figure. So you don't need to think about it as strong arming people into the work. You actually have people who really enjoy working with you. They look up to you. They want to be on your projects. Just make space for their ideas, because sometimes being too controlling or creating too much structure can make people feel like their own ideas are not welcome. Part of what helps people get invested, especially when you're not their boss, is that they have opportunities for growth and testing new things and bringing ideas to the table. So I switched my relationship style, I'm still working on it, from what I felt needed to be more authoritative to instead a much more interdependent and relational approach that, instead of telling people what needed to be done, would involve asking, here's what we're trying to achieve. What do you think should be done? How might we go about approaching this? And the ideas that staff came to the table with have been incredible. Great. And the ownership and leadership they've taken in the work has been deeply impressive. I got into a meeting the other day and was entirely shocked by some of the intellectual leaps they'd been able to make in some of the content of their own accord. I was like, oh, this is cool.
Amazing. Good for you. But good for you for taking that feedback. And this other leader shared some feedback, and you could have been like, "Thank you, but no," and kept doing what you're doing. But you were like, "All right, let me try that." And obviously, it worked really well. So good for you, because getting feedback is one thing, but doing something with it is another. But obviously, they really responded to that. And I agree that I think people, when they feel like they are able to contribute something to a project, there is more buy-in. versus I need you to do A, B, and C by this date, get it done. But
Yeah.
like, what do you think? And we can discuss it. And maybe we don't do B and we do D instead. But let's talk about it and come up with a plan. And I think people get
Yeah.
more excited when they feel like they're actually contributing something more than just the labor.
Yeah, something that was a big realization for me was outside of my work life, I tend to be very relational, very much a connector, again, very empathic. I'm the kind of person who always wants to collaborate and I always want to help heal people. That's very much my personality. And I felt to be successful in a leadership role, I needed to check that at the door. And instead, when I had gotten this feedback, like, what if you took a different approach and you tried coaching instead? It entirely reframed the way I connected with my colleagues. And I realized the very thing that makes me who I am, which I was leaving at the door when I came to work every day, is the very thing that made me more successful in a work environment and strengthened and enhanced my relationships with all of my collaborators. And now just the energy and enthusiasm on the team sort of carries itself. It's just a really interesting insight that outside of work, I knew and recognized that people just want to be seen. They want their skills and strengths and talents to be seen. And making space for that then in the workplace completely changed the dynamic on this team. Once they felt seen, they really stepped into owning the way they were seen, owning the work that they were doing in ways that really played to their already natural strengths and put those on display.
I love that. You're speaking up my alley at this point. This is what I love doing and wanting people to bring their authentic selves to work, especially in leadership, because a core part of who you are shutting it off and trying to go in and be essentially someone that you're not. And it wasn't feeling natural for you and they weren't necessarily aligning with it because something probably felt off, and so when you're like, look, I can be myself, it helps to just open those lines of communication. When you and I chatted originally, I want to say reformed because I think I'm still reforming people pleaser. It's something that I'm working on and aware of, and I think you are as well. But the line between empathy and enabling, and then not going too far into the empathy side where it's no longer supportive, it's now actually unhealthy. Yeah. Have you run into that yet, or have you had to deal with that?
Yeah, and actually I was just thinking about that and responding to the last question. A great example, this came up again earlier this week. One of the projects that I work on was particularly amorphous, we'll say. We had a lot of freedom and flexibility on the project. Because of that, our timelines were timelines that we could set. Our deliverables were deliverables that we could suggest. And in a matrixed environment, where oftentimes team members were juggling multiple projects, including some that were very structured and had very urgent or time-sensitive requirements relative to some of the projects I led, which maybe were a bit more flexible or involved some more creative and dynamic components. The compassionate empath in me often would be the one to budge and say, oh, it's okay, I know everybody's really busy and you have all of these constraints on your other projects. I don't want the team to feel overburdened, and so we'll just keep it fluid. And I thought that was the most compassionate solution. In a few cases, I found that wasn't helping team members, and in fact, it was stressing them out more because it was almost patronizing. It's like, I'm going to think on your behalf, and I'm going to make the decision to keep this timeline fluid so that you don't have to carry the burden of figuring that out for yourself. But in some cases, it would have been kinder to them to say, this is the timeline. I trust you to be responsible for your own workload and other timelines. But because they didn't have clarity with regard to what the timeline or expectations might be for this project, it was very challenging for them to figure out how to fit it in around their other work. And that lack of clarity or that confusion actually made things more stressful. In another case, in an effort not to burden people, I know everybody's really busy, I will just take it on. Or like, don't worry about being the person to speak up in the meeting. I know it's a busy time. I'll lead us through the meeting. But that meant I was the only voice talking us through the agenda in the meeting. So people didn't feel like they had a voice to share their own opinions, perspectives, successes, ideas. And in the same way, it wasn't giving people the opportunity to step in and own the aspects of the work that were important to them. In some instances, I think that leadership approach made things more stressful and more burdensome for other people. And I realized that creating some structure that people can grasp onto gives them the information and clarity they need to make their own decisions and to have agency in how they implement their work across their own work portfolios. And moving toward honoring and acknowledging that has seemed to be really beneficial, even in uncertain times, in a matrix organization and on an abstract or amorphous project.
Now, that's interesting how people operate in that sense, where people really need guidelines and structure, because without it, then I don't really know how to balance this, because you say it's not important, but is it more important than this that I am working on that has a deadline? And if I don't do the right thing, will I get in trouble if I prioritize incorrectly versus here's the deadline? If you have a hard time balancing something, come talk to me if we need to talk about priority, but this is what is needed. But they do need that structure and guidelines to help them move ahead if they don't have that big picture ability to look at that and do that on their own. That's interesting. That's really interesting. So have you found that I guess, when did you start feeling like you could bring yourself in the more empathetic side to you? Is this something that's fairly recent, or has this been a while?
It's a great question. I think I've had waves of it in the past. I think it is different doing it now in a senior leadership role. There have been moments in my career in the past where I did feel invited to bring my ideas and my interests to the table. I'm a very strategic thinker. I'm a very big picture thinker. I like challenging the status quo and taking a problem or challenge and flipping it on its head and looking at it from a different angle. And there definitely have been moments where I was able to bring those parts of my personality and the empath in me to my work, but then figuring out how to balance that with the roles and responsibilities associated with leadership was a bit different, because you're no longer just responsible for showing up as yourself. You're now responsible for showing up as yourself in a way that's curated enough to invite other people to show up as themselves. I think that part probably has been an ongoing journey for about a year, and maybe started to lock in about 6 months ago.
That's fair.
Yeah.
When you talk about moving into senior leadership, is this something that you've always wanted to do, or is it just something that kind of happened that you've adapted to and have grown into?
I think I've always had a sense that I enjoy and naturally gravitate toward leadership roles, not for sake of ego and visibility, but because my brain operates in the space of seeing that big picture. I tend to be the kind of person who can look at a person or a project or an idea and jump 3 million miles ahead and see the potential of what it might be. And I get so excited about that I love the prospect of finding other people who are similarly excited about that, getting them on board, and then thinking creatively and strategically about how to build a team with a diversity of, could be lived experience, could be skills, could be areas of expertise. So demographic diversity, but also cognitive diversity. People who have just lived different lives and who think differently. But to pull together strategically the right complement of people to bring that vision to life, that's kind of my dream. Like, that's my favorite. I get jazzed about that. And so I think leadership naturally lends itself well to that. But I think the process of learning how to be an effective leader and working through some of the kinds of kinks that I mentioned has been, especially in a matrix organization, more challenging than I expected. But I do think I've always had a sense that those are the kinds of roles that I naturally gravitate toward, and that there's something about them that I enjoy.
That's awesome. I never wanted to be a leader, which is so weird because I loved it. But I never saw myself as being somebody that would manage a team or manage an organization of sorts. And when they asked me initially, do you want to consider moving into management? And I said, no. Yeah. Why would I want to do that? But then I started it and I was like, oh my gosh, I actually really love it. Because I'm more of a tactical person. I can do big picture and strategic, but I love getting stuff done. And when you take that part away, now you manage the people who do those things. That was a really big shift for me. It's no longer about what and how much and how quickly I can do. It's now about me motivating and supporting and empowering other people to do that. And that was something that took me a little while to learn. And the delegation piece and the empathy piece that came in with that you talked about, was like, oh, I know that you're really busy, so I'll just do it. Yeah. It was coming from a good place of, I don't want to burn you out. But from other people's perspective, it might be like, wow, what a jerk. She's taking all of the projects and she's taking all of the visibility and the opportunities to grow. And you're like, no, I'm not trying to do that. I don't want to ask you to do it because I know that you've got these other things. And so trying to learn the balance of managing is challenging, especially if you haven't had really great examples of folks who do the empathetic side and the really tactical strategic side well. So it sounds like you also had some examples of come in and just be authoritative and get stuff done. And then you are learning now, I can also bring this side, which makes it so much easier, I think, to manage successfully when you balance both. Yeah. Learning how to integrate both in a way that is productive is, I think, really challenging if you don't have good examples of how to do it.
Yeah, I think so too. And I've had examples on both ends of the spectrum across my career, just people with vastly different leadership styles. And it just has taken me a while to figure out what my voice is or how that works. So for example, the empath in me tends to like to find common ground and to make people feel seen. And something that I never thought twice about, but that I got feedback on at one point, was that when a team member would suggest an idea, if it was something that I genuinely had thought about in past, even if it was just a flickering thought, I would often say, oh, that's a great idea. I thought something similar last week. And as a way to say, I see you, we're on the same wavelength, I'm here with you, I think that's a great idea, let's build it out. But for some people, that actually made them feel like it trivialized their idea.
Oh, I've already had this myself. Like, I already did that, and you're just kind of catching up. Yeah.
Yeah, and until I got that feedback, I thought I was doing something that to me felt natural and like it was making space for people to show up and bring their ideas, and others actually felt like it was discounting their ideas, which was completely not the goal. But I think for me, finding how to exercise who I am and my natural voice and tendencies in a way that lands with people, this maybe is a weird parallel, but it's almost like the parallel of love languages. Like there's a tendency for people to say, well, I've been showing love this whole time because every day before you come home from work, I make sure that the dishes are taken care of. Someone else is like, well, that's all well and good, but really I don't care if the dishes are taken care of. I just want some quality time with you. But if you don't get aligned on what someone else's goals and needs and values are, and then try to figure out how to communicate or connect with them in a way that meets them where they are, you're just ships passing in the night.
Yeah.
It's not translated.
No, but I love that someone told you that, though. Somebody felt comfortable enough to be able to tell you that this actually trivializes and makes you discredit what I'm doing if you're telling me that, like, oh yeah, I already did this too. So I love that somebody felt comfortable enough to tell you. Again, good job, Rachel, because they could just talk to each other and be like, oh, she did that to you too? Yeah, she did that to me. But they said, hey, this is not landing the way that you think it's landing. And that's great that you're like, I didn't realize that.
I had no idea.
Yeah. But I also think that's really important for folks to know, not everybody, but most people are open to feedback. And sometimes they're not doing this intentionally. We always used to use the acronym MRI, like most respectful interpretation. Somebody says something or does something, don't assume it's because they're mad at you. They didn't mean it negatively. It was just they meant it from a good place, but you're assigning meaning to it. So if you view it from a most respectful interpretation or intention, you're like, oh, okay, I just really didn't realize it because this is how I talk at home, my friend. This is just, oh yeah, me too. I think it's really good for folks to feel like they can at least express that, because you could have easily been like, well, that's ridiculous that you feel that way, Erika. Why would you think that? So I love that they felt like they could and that you actually took that and made changes with it to say, thanks for telling me. Oops, I didn't know.
Yeah. That actually reminds me of two different things. One, to your most recent point, I have also observed and had the benefit of leaders in my life who reminded me that when you're getting feedback from people, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, or if you have more information than they do, or if there was something happening behind the scenes that maybe could justify the way you handled something, their interpretation is still valid. The way they felt in that moment is still valid. So when you get that kind of feedback, saying, well, that's not true because XYZ is not really viable, because you can't tell someone how they feel. You can try to justify your rationale, but at the end of the day, their feelings, their experience was still valid. That was still real. And if it's an effective team, you then work together to figure out what was lost in translation such that the two of you perceived something so drastically differently. But I think that was a really kind of helpful way of thinking about that. And then I love your most respectful interpretation language. I've heard the assume the best intent language, and I actually worked with a coach probably just out of grad school, and he noted that most human decisions, behaviors, etc. are motivated by one of 6 core motivators. And sometimes when you can't understand where someone is coming from, if you zoom out and try to assume the best intent, you can almost always figure out that the main motivator is one of these things.
Right.
So it's things like the need for significance, or the need to feel like a contributor, or the need for love and affection, the need for variability versus the need for stability. So there are some times that you can be at odds with someone in a work environment and get really frustrated and take it personally and say, oh, this person's out to get me. Or, oh, this person and I just don't see eye to eye. But if you pause and step back and try to assume the best intent, sometimes the truth is we're not really in an oppositional situation here. We haven't had a conversation about how our priorities align. And it may be if we had that conversation, we could arrive at a mutually reinforcing solution, but we haven't had that conversation. So let's assume the best intent. Maybe it's coming from a different place. It's not personal. Let's pause and have a conversation instead of being confrontational or competitive. Let's be curious about what the other person has in mind. Ask them some questions about their vision, and maybe we can get our visions aligned.
Yeah, I love the be curious. I think that's really important. And we all make assumptions. You talked about perception. Perception is reality. How you perceive it that's real to you. And even if, again, you don't have the full picture and there's other pieces to it, what I've seen, what I experience, I'm viewing it this way and this is how I feel about it. But if you just make that assumption and you assign some kind of intent to it, you can build negativity and frustration or whatever negative emotion you want. You can build on that. And so everything that person starts doing, if you're viewing it through that lens of it's coming from this negative place, you start to get really resentful. Whereas if you just be curious and maybe even ask a question and say, when you said this earlier, did you mean this? Or, or I maybe took it this way. Is that what you intended? I'm glad we cleared that up, because now I don't have to go weeks thinking that we're enemies somehow at work when it wasn't even on the radar. It had nothing to do with me, but I'm assuming because everybody assigns meaning and emotion to everything that happens. Something I actually learned yesterday from a neuroscientist about messaging and wording. Words don't mean anything, but if I said just a random word to you like potato, you might have something that you assign to that where it's a really good thing or really bad thing, because we assign emotion to everything. And so what we think we are saying is not actually what that other person might be receiving, because of the lens and the life experiences and how they view it, that they're attributing to it. So I might tell you, like, Rachel, my favorite color is purple. What did I just say? And you're like, you hate pink. I didn't say that. That's how you assumed and interpreted that statement. And so it's really important when you're giving feedback or when you're talking. I might be very clear about feedback I'm giving you, but I always want to check, can you repeat back like a summary of what we chatted about, that make sure that we're on the same page. And if you're like, yeah, you told me that you hate pink and that I suck at my job, I'm glad we confirmed that before you left, because you would have walked out like, she's a terrible boss. And that's not at all what I said. Let's make sure that we're hearing it without the filters, so that what I say is what you're receiving. And it's not just at work. This is in any relationships and just any kind of interactions. We do this where somebody might just say something in passing that we take very, very far from what it was intended to be. And then we stew on it. And then we get resentful or we get angry. So it's really fascinating how the human brain works and how it impacts these dynamics, especially in a leadership role, because ultimately you as the leader are responsible for making sure that things are clear. And you can't do it if you don't know that there's a problem or a misinterpretation. But if you do know that, then it's on you to squash that and fix it as best as possible.
Yeah, I think for me, and it's been part of this pretty intentional journey. I started getting feedback in both my personal and professional life around the same time that was mirroring. And so at some point I went, okay, it would be really nice and convenient in these moments to say, oh, it's not me. But once you start hearing a theme, you're like, might be me. So I took about a year and did some very intentional, thoughtful work, not especially glamorous, a little bit unflattering at times. But one of the things I realized was that in moments when I felt insecure, I thought the best way to demonstrate confidence, to instill other people's confidence in me, and also to help especially at work, other team members, other colleagues feel confident, was to come in and be initiative taking. I would go into the meeting with a plan and with talking points, and I felt like preparedness was the thing. If I could go in and be as prepared as possible through every contingency and every possible answer and how to justify every decision, that's what was going to make me strong and successful. And I realized that in doing that, it was a reflection of insecurity. A much stronger sign of security is to say, I know where we're going. I know that I have a plan, but I know that I'm confident and resilient enough in myself. I'm assured enough in myself that even if I get some new piece of information or I learn something that feels uncomfortable, it's not going to rock me. We're going to be able to pivot. We're going to come up with a solution. And that's a much more secure way to approach both your personal and professional relationships. And I realized that in the former state, I wasn't asking questions. I was being proactive. I would come in with a plan, but it was rigid. That proactive plan was based on what was in my head or in my vision. I did that because I didn't want to be reactive. I didn't want to be in a situation where life would throw something at me and I would be blindsided by it and I'd have to panic and freak out. The real goal was to get right in the middle and to be responsive, where you have your own plan that's informed by what's inside your head, but then you're also able to be reactive, responding to new information that's coming from outside of your head and the world around you, and then that positions you to be as secure as possible. And something I observed was that a couple people I know who aren't especially good at being responsive would also go into these calls with a whole agenda or sets of feedback and would deliver this feedback without understanding the full context. And I caught myself wishing that they would have come in and first asked me a few questions. Like, before I give you all this feedback, let me ask a few questions about the situation. What do you think you did well? What do you think would benefit the team in future? So on and so forth. And then I realized I wanted others to do that for me, but I wasn't doing that. So I started incorporating questions into my work style much more regularly and approaching my work more with curiosity. Being responsive, being open to what people came back with, and that open dialogue or that open rapport then ended up changing the tone of both my personal and professional relationships. And I think that's then what made me finally feel secure enough to bring my whole self to the table, to be more empathic and more compassionate and more assured. I didn't feel insecure anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you feel, not to like get like deep therapy session, but do you feel like your need for wanting to come in with prepared plans was trauma response?
I do think it's a bit of a standing joke in my family. When I was younger, I never wanted to be caught off guard. So I developed this habit, and anyone who knows me and might listen to this will laugh at this. I developed a habit of always carrying a heavy bag with all the stuff in it because I didn't want to be caught off guard. I didn't want to have 30 minutes when I could have gone to the gym, but I didn't have my sneakers with me. So I would just carry everything with me all the time. And I think it was kind of a reflection of feeling like I needed a shield. If I didn't have this shield, or if I wasn't fully prepared, or I didn't always have a toolkit at my disposal, I wouldn't be able to handle things. And at a couple key moments in my life, pretty significant ones, I either in a chosen way or a thrown into the deep end way, caught myself in these moments where I did not have the toolkit and realized that I was just fine. And actually, I kind of thrived in that environment of having to get creative and figure it out. That's really when I got my footing. I was like, oh, maybe I don't need the heavy bag anymore. Maybe I don't need the security blanket or the over preparedness.
Right.
Turns out I'm actually a better public speaker on the fly than if I have talking points in front of me. I have talking points in front of me, I overcomplicate and I over articulate, and it exhausts people. So I'm much better to just go with it. But until I caught myself in that spot, I didn't realize that that was a strength. So maybe there's something there to be said for knowing what your strengths are and recognizing that there's maybe a shadow side to each one of them.
Yeah, for sure. Because when you mentioned it, I recognize that in myself, and I think mine is also, it's a trauma response, but not to ever be vulnerable and to always shield and just be prepared. And when I learned that being vulnerable is so much stronger than being polished in perfection all the time, that I can't even put it into words. It's just a night and day difference. You were saying when I would trust in myself that no matter what is happening, I trust in my abilities and my team and my leadership enough that like even if something totally unexpected happens, we'll be okay. And that's what people want. They don't necessarily need the plan. They want somebody who has the emotional intelligence to say like, we're under control. And even if something is crazy and it's, we might be a little bit stressed about, but we're going to be fine. Yeah. We're not losing our heads and screaming and freaking out. Like that's what makes people panic. But if you trust in myself, and I don't know what we're going to see. I don't know what we're going to do yet because I don't know what we're up against. But I know that it'll work out. And I think that is something where you start to trust in yourself and let go of that shield and say, I don't have to always be a certain way. And it's nice too that you're finding that you actually did better without it, that you were like, I'm much more creative and more comfortable and natural when I just am versus when I like, here's my trusty, whatever it is that I have in my bag.
Yeah, I just recently saw something online that really stood out to me. It perfectly captures this sort of journey that I had been on. To your point about almost having this shield up or feeling like, you always have to be perfect or everything always has to be tucked in, that actually tends to be very off-putting to people.
Yes.
And it creates distance. And I increasingly leaned into the idea that being present, like fully present, inclusive of your flaws and failures and quirks and whatever, is actually a much stronger relational tool than showing up and being perfect. In some ways undermines people's trust in you because they don't believe you're real.
Right.
They think you're phony. There's something untrustworthy and distancing about that. If there's some sense that, you feel like things are only good enough if they're on a pedestal or at a certain degree of polish. And I saw something somewhere on the internet where an influencer was talking about the distinction between being emotionally available, like truly emotionally available and open to emotional intimacy, versus being emotionally performative. The idea being that in his case, he made it gendered. I do think there's some element of masculine or feminine energy here, but not necessarily specifically tied to someone who identifies with a certain gender.
Right.
He's saying a lot of women believe themselves to be emotionally available, but they're really no more emotionally available than their male counterparts. I pushed back a little bit in the comments. I didn't like the generalization, but what I did say was because I was emotionally articulate, I could talk about my feelings, I could analyze my feelings. I caught myself in cases where I didn't have to be vulnerable with people because it sounded like I knew what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And it sounded like I understood my feelings. So people wouldn't check in and say, hey, are you okay? What's going on? I never had to answer the vulnerable questions, and I was able to use it like a shield to keep from leaning into real vulnerability. Just like the difference between thinking your feelings and actually feeling your feelings.
Yeah.
And then at some point you say, no, if I'm going to be an effective leader, an effective partner, an effective friend, or whatever it is, at some point you take the shield down, recognize people are going to see you with all of your imperfections, but that is going to be a shared experience in vulnerability. And that's actually how you build that kind of relational or social capital in a meaningful way, in a way that's not transactional or performative.
100%. And that's the part that is scary for people because you have to, we talked about trauma, is it a trauma response? You have to face the inner shadows of whatever is causing you to feel like you have to be perfect or that you have to put on this display. And that's uncomfortable. And most people don't want to do that, especially not in a work environment because they feel like that's going to discredit my abilities or my experience. And it doesn't. Just thinking about the human brain and the critter brain, kind of the primitive brain, what is like me is safe, what is not like me is scary. And so if you are coming off as a perfectionist and I don't trust that that's real, I don't feel safe with you because I know that I'm not perfect. And so I want to see other people who are flawed and who acknowledge that. And that's part of how you build those relationships. And I think a lot of people aren't quite ready to do. And it's not a gender thing, it can be male and female, but it's scary. You have to acknowledge your whole self, and sometimes the whole self is not always stuff that we want to admit and recognize, but it's there, and it makes us who we are.
Yeah, I used to keep my parts very separate. I don't know if it was just natural to me or what. I realized I would think about my personal development, my professional development, my spiritual development, whatever it was, in these separate buckets, and life sort of forced the issue of bringing them all into alignment. And when it did, it was a huge aha moment. My growth trajectory accelerated in a way that I still honestly don't understand. Like just the amount of self-awareness and consciousness that I developed in a short period of time was a bit wild. But at some point I realized if you invite all of your parts to the table, they will all work together in concert for you. It's much easier than trying to fight the uphill battle of forcing yourself into boxes that you don't belong, when the truth is we're all quite complex.
Yes.
And nuanced, and that's something to be celebrated and not factored out of the equation or erased. And that's where I think real originality and ingenuity gets to shine in a workplace. I will just quickly challenge something that you said earlier and maybe ask you a question. I was really struck when you said you didn't see yourself or you never thought you wanted to step into leadership, particularly as someone who has founded a thing.
Yep.
And started a thing. To me, I've always seen that as the ultimate sign of leadership. And so as I was thinking about the parts pieces, I was like, well, you definitely have parts of you that demonstrate leadership, because to be able to take initiative and have a vision and implement your own thing, to me, is like the ultimate exercise of leadership. So that, I don't know, that stood out to me.
Yeah, no, that's fair. This was also like 15 years ago when I first started. So this wasn't something like a week ago. I was like, I don't want to do leadership, but let me be a coach. It was more that because I was really empathetic and I was more subdued and quiet and very introverted, I didn't feel like I fit in with what I saw leadership being, because I thought that I had to fit into this box of being more assertive, being more directive almost.
Yeah.
I had some good leaders growing up, but most of what I saw I did not necessarily agree with, and I did not want to be that, and I felt like I'd have to really adapt myself to fit into that kind of box. So when they said, do you want to be a manager? I thought, no, I'm not going to be a good manager. But then when I was able to start being myself and seeing how that actually worked really well.
Yeah.
Now, granted, there was a lot of development that needed to happen. I wasn't like, I'm an amazing manager from day one. But I realized I didn't have to be what I always thought managers and leaders were. I could be
Mm,
myself, but with some tailoring, like we talked about, not being
yeah.
enabling, but be empathetic, but still holding people accountable and setting
Mm.
guidelines and supporting them to get there, how to do that. And so once I learned that you could do it authentically, that's when I really loved it. And to be honest, I hate this, it sounds really arrogant, but I feel like the majority of us do it wrong because we're not being ourselves. And I love just hearing how you are doing it and how you're talking about what your experiences are, that you sound like you're doing it really well. And I think people who take the time to do the self work and acknowledge, here's where I'm not great. Here's where I could do better, and here's something that I do really well, but not this part. And I think when we acknowledge that and then work to fix that, I think you can be a fantastic leader. But until then, I did not think that I would be a good leader just based on who I was and how I was, but I was trying to fit into an outdated mold. And so now if you ask me, like, yes, I love leading and coaching and developing, but
Yeah.
before it was not something that I had ever thought that I would do with my life/career.
It's interesting to me that the first thought, which is, I think many of us are guilty of this, but the first thought was like, I don't think I would be a good leader because that's how I've seen leadership defined. And now I think, at least for me, maybe similar for you or for others in this position, we would probably say there's a problem with how we look at leadership. Maybe the problem wasn't with me. Not to say there isn't room for like growth and personal and professional development. Obviously, I've taken that on and I think it's really important and I'm working through it. But I remember somebody once asked me, like, do you ever think you would consider going into politics? And my response was no, because I look at a lot of people in those positions and it seems like you can't be a successful political leader and also be empathic. And like, that's just part of who I am. And thinking about that now, I'm like, wow, that stinks. Like, it stinks
Yeah.
that that's our conception of
And that's the
leadership.
problem. Like, we have conditioned and built politicians to be this way. We have promoted leaders who are this way, and that's
Yeah.
what we're seeing. But I think we're getting to a point now where, like, this is not working. Like, our government is a
Right.
hot mess. Leadership,
Right.
this is a very up number, but 80% of it is a hot mess. But this is how it's always been, but that shouldn't be how it is. And that's why I feel like I'm maybe a little bit ahead of the curve as far as wanting to
Yeah.
do what I'm trying to do, because I think most are still, this has always worked for us. This is how we do leadership, but it shouldn't be. Because I think
Right.
people like you who are showing, when you show empathy and give people more opportunity to be themselves and to speak up, they thrive. And when you care
Yeah.
about them, they thrive versus I'm your boss, get it done. Great, we're hitting our numbers, but like they hate their lives, they hate their jobs, they all are on 4 different antidepressants. Is this really how we do it? Yes, you might be a really fantastic politician for where we want to build and where we want politics to go. But right now, I feel like you would not thrive there because it's not wanted. And that's
Yeah.
what is so hard, is lifestyle leadership isn't necessarily popular yet. Like you
Right.
being an empathetic politician would not be popular yet, but it's needed.
Right.
And
Right.
that's where I think it's that tiny spark, and hopefully it starts to spread and light other, candles along the way. But right now it's just one little flame really trying to
Yeah.
stand against the wind.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it kind of gets at my like deepest desire and hope, frankly. I get on the soapbox about this a lot and I will keep it toned down here. But I think people talk about diversity and inclusion in entirely the wrong way, in a way that is very tokenistic and unfortunate.
Yes.
But I think what is going to start to move the needle, and I think what is starting to move the needle in terms of how people think about leadership or even collaboration, is the reality that those outdated styles of leadership don't work. Like the product, the end result is more likely to be effective when you have the right people at the table bringing their diverse skill sets, their diverse knowledge bases. We often use some of the projects I work on focus on this field of engagement science. Like, what are the best practices for meaningfully engaging very diverse partners in collaborative projects? And my dream is, what if you had a big, scary, complex challenge and you got 15 people in the room and you figured out exactly how to activate each one of those people so that they were operating at their optimal level and they were each bringing their highest level skills and strengths to the table? The power of that group to solve a problem, even a challenging one, would be magnified and amplified multiple times over. And so if you just say, I'm your boss, I need you to get this thing done, that's very different from activating someone's skills and strengths. And what we see often in the engagement science space is that if you try to design a tool, a policy, a practice in a vacuum, based on your own expertise, you might come up with a product that is perfect on paper, But then you take it and you drop it into the real world and say, okay, now we're going to use this tool in a hospital. We're going to implement this policy in setting X. And because you haven't heard from people with lived experience in setting X who can tell you what their needs and challenges are, the policy fails. It doesn't do anything because you didn't actually take into account the context expertise of the people who know their bodies, their brains, their communities, their environments better than you do. You just took into account your own content expertise. So it's really only when you have these new styles of leadership that are more relational, are more empathic and compassionate, and that invite and integrate all of these different perspectives that you get results with real world solutions. And some people will say, oh, that takes more time and effort. It takes more time and effort, but it also reduces research waste. It also saves money, time, and energy because you're not implementing policies and practices that are going to fail. So there's an economic benefit to having a different style of leadership.
Put a little bit of effort up front. It's going to pay off later.
Right, exactly.
Versus let's just keep doing what we're doing that's not working, and we try new things. Like, do it right the first time.
Yeah.
That mindset, again, everything is outdated. It's just how we've always done it. Why not just keep doing this? And that doesn't work.
It's not working. And I think people are starting to see that it's not working.
Yeah.
I won't go too far into politics, but I do think part of the reason we saw a change, even in people's voting behaviors or attitudes, is because even if they're not thrilled with everything happening in the world right now, they felt like something wasn't working. Like something wasn't working for them in their communities, in their environments. I think it is going to take a different style of leadership to really move the needle in the ways we need, but there is, at least I sense, a growing recognition that it requires different kinds of connections, different kinds of collaboration to really meet people where they are, get their needs met, and do work with impact. So I'm hopeful that even if you're on the cutting edge, that other people are coming along with you and starting to celebrate new and emerging kinds of leadership that are maybe more relational.
Me too. You're preaching to the choir, Rachel. Now, I think there's definitely people out there. It's just getting in front of the right groups that will take it and run with it. I have not talked to one person that's like, that sounds like a waste of time. Why would you do that? Like, nobody has said that. But my boss should talk to you, somebody else, but it's never I should talk to you. And so there's, I think, that lack of self-awareness. Even I'm not an expert on everything. There's definitely parts that I could still learn and do better. Nobody is perfect. We all have room for improvement, because even if you know all the right things, different personalities bring out different responses in you, and you have to think, okay, well, how I would do this with Rachel isn't how I'm going to do this with Bob, because personalities are different. So you're always on your toes, and you have to be able to adapt to new scenarios. It's not a one-size-fits-all for your team. Leadership's not a one-size-fits-all for each leader. How you lead is probably a little bit different than how I would lead, and it's based on so many factors. And you need to learn different ways of doing things. So this is how I've learned it, and this has worked for me for 40 years. Well, like, a lot has changed in 40 years, Let's get on board with maybe something different.
Yeah, I agree.
Rachel, I could talk to you for hours about all of this. This is fascinating stuff. But thank you very, very much for taking time today to talk with me.
Yes.
If anybody is interested in hearing about the really fascinating stuff that you're working on, or just want to get in touch with you or connect, how can they find you?
Good question. I will very soon hopefully be setting up a Substack page and putting out some writing there. I think in the meantime, the most surefire bet is on LinkedIn. So you can go to my LinkedIn page. You can find me there. I am also on other social platforms, Threads, X, Instagram, but each one sort of with a different purpose and intention. Also, if anybody reaches out to you, I'm happy to share my email address or contact information that way as well.
Okay, perfect. So I'll get your handles and different things. I'll put them in the show notes. And then again, if anyone wants an email, you can reach out to me directly to get that, and we'll get you in touch. Thank you again so much for your time and just sharing your perspectives. I think it is great stuff, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. I was really glad to be invited, and I really enjoy the authenticity and the tone that you bring to your presence online. And I think that's what first got me excited and kind of following along. And so I'm glad to be invited to join the journey, and we'll hopefully look forward to collaborating again in the future. But this was great. I could do this for hours.
Yeah, I'm like, man, no, but thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. We'll catch you on the next episode of Stumbling Forward.